results of years of Republican neglect. The highest unemployment in 8 years. The Republicans actually stalled the extension of unemployment benefits, blocked a middle-class tax cut that would help the economy, cut Medicare for senior citizens, and tried to reduce college loans. The Republican leadership, a record of failure. The highest unemployment in 8 years, the worst economic record since the Great Depression. Aren't you ready to say enough is enough? Vote Democratic for a change.
Government just isn't working for the hard-working families of America. We need fundamental change, not more of the same. That's why I've offered a comprehensive plan, a real plan to rebuild America. Create 8 million new jobs, invest in education and job training, ensure quality, affordable health care for all. We're going to ask the rich to pay their fair share so the rest of America can finally get a break. A plan to put government back on your side. Read it yourself. Together we can make America work again.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. I am Michael Brooks. We are broadcasting from downtown Brooklyn, USA. Some of us with loose ties, where we say Lou La Livre with super producer Matt Leck.
Hello.
Chief economist and cashmere extraordinaire, David Griscom.
How's it going?
On this week's program, the great, the peerless Adolph Reed Jr. I had the incredible honor of interviewing scholar, activist, commentator, the brilliant author of many books, including the indispensable Class Notes, as well as a recent essay in the New Republic called The Myth of Economic Reductionism that everybody must read urgently. Adolph Reed Jr. Did this interview for a couple weeks ago. It's been available for patrons. We talk about essentialism, the professional managerial class, the election, power, how things actually change, South Africa and here, Adolph Reed Jr. And then I'm incredibly excited to announce that the mega talented, the great Abby Martin of Empire Files, co-director of the extraordinary new documentary Gaza Fights For Freedom, is going to be here. We're talking about Gaza fighting for freedom. We're talking about why Donald Trump is the fulfillment and the extension of U.S. empire. No way a contradiction of it. And I think we're going to keep it a little bit real on Tulsi Gabbard, everybody. Plus, we have a gem with the great David Griscom, a post-game for patrons where our friend, the great Nando Vila, is going to be here in studio. We're going to be talking about Maradona, soccer. We're going to be reviewing the incredible rally with Bernie Sanders and Ilhan Omar and Keith Ellison in Minnesota. We've got a bunch of clips from that. There's coup-mongering from the right in Bolivia, almost certainly a U.S. role. What's happening in Spain? Plus, a shout out, Sanders' weed plan is about freedom and justice, and that's why it's the best plan put on the table. It's about expunging all records, legalizing weed, and also restitution for the communities most deeply victimized by the unjust, horrifying war on drugs, all that, and some sound from Salvador Allende as we continue in solidarity with these global uprisings. Check out the stream that I just did with Kim Ives on Haiti. That's incredibly important stuff, lots to get to. But first, let's talk about the middle class and why it's a problematic political frame. It's so problematic, I'll use the word problematic, which you know I'm loath to use. There is a similarity in rhetorical strategy and emphasis on wonkery between the 1992 Bill Clinton campaign and the 2020 Elizabeth Warren campaign. This, despite the significant historical positional differences and even the fact, obviously, that Elizabeth Warren is a better person than Bill Clinton, reveals some fundamental differences, fundamental weaknesses of a technocratic, quote unquote, mainstream middle class approach. One, and we're going to get to this Warren clip in a second, the term middle class is so overused and so abused in American rhetoric that it is not a point of historical and economic understanding. It's a fantasy trope that covers so much in the American imagination as to be irrelevant. We have a dynamic in the United States where some incredible hoarders of great wealth still want to claim middle-class modesty. And then we have people who, through shame and subjugation because of the cultural ramifications of how ruthless we do capitalism in this country, feel so much ashamed of poverty and working classness that they project themselves onto the middle class. Elizabeth Warren released a detailed plan with some major holes and questions, potentially even some big structural problems, about how to fund Bernie Sanders' bill for Medicare for All. The biggest problem in it, and there's a lot of actually commendable things here, but the biggest problem is the choice she made to do a head tax on businesses to provide for a national health system. Tomorrow, we go in depth with Anna Kasparian. That will be premiered tomorrow. But the bottom line is, and this is as reported by Matt Brunig, this is an incredibly regressive move. And in fact, it's a hidden tax. But she chose to do it apparently so as to still have the ability to say that her bill has no middle-class tax increases. This, first of all, is an increase in terms of reality and overall cost. And it also feeds on some of her core weaknesses. This is Elizabeth Warren explaining why, or not really explaining. Look at her. I don't even know how to properly frame this. What is middle class, according to Elizabeth Warren? This was from over the weekend.
Senator, when you say you won't raise middle class taxes, what is the income bracket that you use to define?
Here it's 100%. It doesn't raise taxes on anybody but billionaires. And you know what? The billionaires can afford it, and I don't call them middle class. So billionaire, that's where it worked.
Anyone under $1 billion net worth.
That's right. It's not paying a penny more. That's exactly right.
Senator, when you say...
So I think we can all understand that that's an extraordinarily problematic formulation that can really narrow some of the range of questions we need to have in this country and policies we need to explore, not just about distribution and taxes, but about power. And that is another through line here. See, in 1992, Bill Clinton ran a quite populist campaign. And he had a plan that anybody could read in order. It was called People First, putting people first. And it had detailed policy proposals for a national health insurance system, for middle-class tax cuts, for infrastructure spending and stimulus. While he was extremely unclear and evasive on NAFTA, which was, of course, a direct threat to the working class. Ultimately, obviously, he favored NAFTA. In both instances, the rhetoric of middle classness has been elevated over the rhetoric of power and labor. And this does go back again to the fundamental question of how you are framing change and how you are framing your political project. This is a core, vast difference between Sanders and Warren, and also goes right to the heart of whether or not we can even hope to pray to achieve, quote unquote, big structural change. Bill Clinton's campaign argued that it wasn't afraid to take on unions and labor in favor of middle-class values. In the face of working class mobilization, a coalition of the PMC, upper middle-class voters, and around Warren, the coalition of the vote around Warren is worryingly similar to the Democratic Party tradition of preferring the middle class to class struggle. This again goes back to the 1970s and the 1980s and the rise of the Atari Democrats. And it's not just the most intense expressions of right-wing neoliberalism like the Bill Clinton 1996 campaign, but even the more populist 1992 one, which emphasized a need to achieve things for people who work hard and play by the rules. Elizabeth Warren talks constantly about how there used to be a way up the economic ladder, and things are rigged, and things have been taken away from where they used to be. And a lot less about a fundamental redistribution of power to labor. And in fact, the system that she points towards idealizing was predicated on the power of labor, not more enlightened regulators and bureaucrats and corporations. And also just the idea that through certain universal programs, we just guarantee a great standard and basic standard of life for all people, regardless of where they're trying to play up the class system of quote unquote meritocracy. Warren's tendencies to push more moderate versions of Bernie's plans is also worrying. The cancellation of debt for some, not others, creating complicated technocratic plans, talking about the corruption of the system rather than the system itself. The more moderate wing of the Democratic Party and media sees Warren as an opportunity to ride the wave of popular frustration into office by pushing a watered-down Bernie plans. This is a very important thing to highlight here. There's three different responses in the popular discourse. Some people who are obsessed with wonkery try to get cute and say that Warren's more of a threat to Sanders. We can easily put that argument aside. That's obvious from anybody who has any kind of understanding about politics or how power works. But the second thing that's interesting is that, yes, there are some oligarchs like the billionaire baby who is crying about Warren's, modest wealth tax the other day on CNBC. There are a lot of people in the American oligarchy who are so delusional and bratty that any response to them that involves anything of substance, they're going to have a meltdown and cry about, including some of Warren's solid, modest reforms. There is another tendency of people in the oligarch class, and there's reporting on this as well. There were several articles that came out in the summer of people who recognize, and if you've been reading the editorial page of the Financial Times for a while, the smart part of these classes that recognize, look, things are really fucking bad, and we need to ease up the pressure. But we do not want to concede anything fundamental in terms of power relations. They're going to be extremely intrigued by the Warren campaign. Look at the George Soroses of the world. The climate is different in 2019 than 1992. But Warren, for an example, stretching the concept to include anyone who is less than a billionaire is laughable. This kind of muddling is dangerous. Yes, billionaires are odious, but people with hundreds of millions of dollars are just as damaging and need to be understood in the structural context of capital as well. We need a movement. Bill Clinton, who ran a campaign to the right of Warren, learned very quickly in office that there are plenty of structural constraints on American democracy. When he was told by an advisor, by Alan Greenspan, who had become head of the Fed, that bondholders effectively controlled the fate of his economic plan, Clinton is said to have said, "You mean to tell me the success of my economic programs, my re-election depends on the Federal Reserve and a bunch of fucking bondholders?" This was a guy who ran on demolishing welfare and fighting unions. Imagine the kind of fight a more mild reformer like Warren will face. It is not just a quote unquote idealist option to understand that you need to take on the fundamental building blocks of power and have a movement to do it. It is literally a necessity because it is the only way and the only prayer of countervailing that power, which is why we need a politics of class, a politics that is unafraid of talking about labor, of power, and also clearly delineates poverty and not just the magical escape hatch of middle classness, which is rapidly becoming a thing of the past anyways after 40 years of globalization. Do you guys have anything to add to that?
I mean, I would just, double down on that last point that you made, that whenever left-wing governments come into power, even mild ones, they face massive structural constraints. And especially in the United States, our system is meant to water down any kind of transformative politics. So if you're already coming in there from a weaker half position, what's going to come out on the other end is not going to really represent the ideals that you try to triangulate from in the first place. And, it's very much a moment right now where we have the choice to choose between class struggle politics or reformist politics. And we can see how reforms constantly are undermined. Even look at, the CFPB, right, which was a huge achievement of Warren. Now under Trump, it's been very much gutted, and It's very, very weak. So this is an example of, like, if you don't address the power, right? The people who you should have been targeting, that the CFPB was targeting in the first place, and you leave those people in power, they're going to find a way to come back and to undermine the work that you do. And
it's actually fascinating. That's a great point, because people always say, they always talk about the CFPB as such an example of her bureaucratic genius. And it was. I mean, every account says she played it incredibly shrewdly. She had to fight against many forces in the Obama administration of Wall Street, obviously, but okay. And then you throw the keys to a Republican administration. First, they tried to get rid of it, and then they realized they could just make it impotent, or they could even make it worse for people.
And I would just add real quick, is like, the thing about Warren is that she really does understand the American system well enough to be able to jump through those hurdles, but it's the time question that really becomes a challenge.
I've been freaked out a little bit in the, when you get paranoid like Elon Musk as to whether we're living in a simulation or not.
Right.
When it comes to how dead on the nose presidential mottos have been in terms of sort of the core problems of those campaigns. So Hillary, you have Ready for Hillary, which encapsulates the sort of bureaucratic climbing nature of it.
And the empty, just
right, just nothing. Yeah.
Right.
Like why should we care?
Yeah. Okay.
Then you have Warren. She's got a plan, which is the sort of technocracy of it. And then Bernie, you have not me, us, right? I was watching this Toni Morrison interview with Charlie Rose from 1993 because I'm going to be doing some Toni Morrison stuff on Literary Hangover for jazz.
By the way, well done plug. That's how you do a plug. It's called native content.
And and well, see how native this is. Like, this is exactly relevant to what we're discussing with the conversations here.
When you think about the politics of America, political leaders don't have the will to deal. The political will to deal with those.
I don't know about those guys. I mean, I'd be befuddled by them. I'm really befuddled. I guess it's just power and power strategies, and I got mine and you get yours. We talk now about the man who is now the president of the country. I hear people say he is going to have difficulty getting his health care plan through, or he is going to have trouble getting his stimulus. It's not his, it's ours. It's not a personal relationship. It's ours. Or it's not ours. It's not his war against Bosnia. It's ours. So this confrontational, personal relationship with these leaders is really boring me a lot, because it's almost as though
they personalize the conflict.
That's right. And as though we don't participate in it, although we don't have.
And I actually think it's interesting. I mean, I don't know how formal these conversations are, but Cornel West speaks very movingly of Toni Morrison, how her work has been something that has inspired him and he's worked off of. And obviously Cornel West is an advisor of Bernie Sanders. And I mean, look, not me, us is a precise inversion of that melodrama. And I think, I notice again, even in that frame, it's just so revealing that it's like a view of politics that says we're going to sit on the outside and watch the smartest people do this and that. And sure, maybe we'll make some phone calls or whatever, but let's be honest. She has a plan for that. She understands the bureaucracy. I mean, all of these are predicated on it's a spectator sport. Organizer-in-chief, not me, us, is both not a spectator sport, and that does speak, I think, to our highest aspirations in terms of power and politics. But it's also like literally, I mean, are you kidding me? Do you think, don't think for a second that I think, oh yeah, you just got to go out and persuade people on Medicare for all. This is going to be a brass knuckle, and frankly, thankfully, not literally, drag out fight against maybe the most the most powerful overclass in global history. That's political. That's not technocratic. It's not persuasive. Those things all play a role, but they're second order. And Toni Morrison, she nailed that beautifully. All right, let's get to the shout out. Shout out, shout out, shout out. Nervous Curtains. Shout out to them. Shout out, shout out, shout out, shout out.
My brain is still in recovery mode.
Shout out
From taking in so many high-level important ideas.
Shout out
From taking in so many high-level important ideas.
How is somebody so
I like talking about ideas. High-level. The exchange.
Shout out
High level. Still in recovery mode.
Looking forward to sharing more ideas.
Oh my God, it's incredible. All right, folks. We need to legalize drugs. And most especially and urgently marijuana. And in fact, this is a really serious issue of justice. The drug war is a self-licking ice cream cone. It helps fuel actually right-wing terrorism across the globe and various covert U.S. foreign policies from Afghanistan to Nicaragua. And in the United States, it has been the tip of the spear of obviously systemic racism, over-incarceration across all populations, and the methodological terrorism by law enforcement of broad swaths of America in specific communities of color and of poverty. So we need to legalize weed. But we also need to legalize weed in a way that delivers on justice and doesn't replicate a new set of basically big tobacco monopolies in the weed space, which some state legalization initiatives have essentially turned into another set of just sort of big conglomerate business. So we need freedom, we need restitution, and we need the opportunity for grassroots small-scale business. Well, guess who has an A+ in all of this? The Bernie Sanders legalization plan of marijuana. This is an incredible push that Bernie Sanders has put out. And you should be letting everybody you know about this legislation. Here are the key points. Do we have this up on screen? We have this up on screen. Legalize marijuana in the first 100 days with an executive order. Vacate and expunge all past marijuana-related convictions. This will help millions of human beings. Ensure that the revenue from legal marijuana is reinvested in communities hit hardest by the war on drugs. I believe that number goes up to 20 billion. Ensure legalized marijuana does not turn into big tobacco. Now, all of these policy areas have detailed plans, but I just wanted to emphasize that because overturning and commenting the drug war and treating drugs as recreation, mind expansion, or where it's a problem, a public health crisis, is urgent and fundamental. And the Sanders marijuana plan is one of the most elegant plans and visions that scores an A across all metrics that I've ever seen. So shout out to the Bernie Sanders campaign. Excellent weed proposal. All right, let's get to the pitch, and then we will go to our friend Abby Martin. So first, I just want to say, guys, we're definitely going to sell out the Philly live show. So get your tickets now. World Cafe, November 23rd. Crystal Ball, Artesia Balthrop, Emma Vigeland. Buy your tickets now. We should have links. Do we have links where people can find all of that stuff? This is also an 18 and above, it's an all ages show. So people in the past who've wanted to come catch us, don't worry about it. But, bring your folks along. Turn them on to the amazing TMBS experience. On Friday, Kyle Kalinske and I are going to be doing an event in New Haven for Yaleys for Bernie Sanders, to which I say, frankly, it's going to be a tremendous event, and many people are looking at it very strongly in a certain sense. Also, Harvard, where are you at? I mean, Jesus Christ. On November 22nd, I'm moderating a Jacobin panel with Cristobal and Matt Karp at the Verso Loft. Who's Afraid of Bernie Sanders? So those are all the housekeeping. Guys, some of you, some people fall off. Some people need to make sure their credit card is up to date. We actually are doing a lot better in terms of keeping people's info up to date. And we crossed 3,000 last month. I think we're 3 short of 3,000 at the start of showtime. I'm sure we'll get well over that. I'd like at the end of the ends of this week to be at around, say, 3,040 or 3,050. you get just vastly more content as a Michael Brooks Show patron. And honestly, we get messages that even I it feels almost a little too self-serving or not self-serving, but like almost embarrassing to read. But I mean, people are really influenced by the show. And that's just because of the incredible amount of work that's put into it, this amazing network of talented human beings that we have as guests and contributors and collaborators, and the seriousness that goes into everything. So incredibly proud of it. Become a patron today, patreon.com/TMBS. Now I want to play a clip because I want to talk specifically about why, if you can, you should join us at a $21 level and become a comrade or above patron. These things happen, once every 6 weeks or 2 months. There's a huge amount of work that goes into them. The video illicit histories are extracted from our Sunday shows. The Sunday shows go out to everyone every Sunday. Sometimes they're idea primers. Every paying member. Sometimes they're idea primers. Sometimes they are focused on history. Illicit history is the frame, because very specifically understanding weapons, drugs, the real story of American foreign policy, or even someone like Pepe Escobar telling us about a multipolar world. This is how we get into the details of how the world works. Those Sunday shows happen, and they're really, really good. And then what we do is sometimes we build them into these video illicit histories with the incredible work of Vic Viana, who's just mind-blowingly talented. And we put them together, and obviously also Forrest helps us a huge amount as well. Now, what we do is that patrons at a comrade and above level, in addition to the calls you get once or twice a month, get these shows first. But then we release them to everybody on YouTube because we want everybody to watch these, basically. We have a playlist on our YouTube channel of illicit histories. I watch all of them, from Jesse Jackson to healthcare to Brazil. And I want to play a short clip of the latest one we just released on destabilization, the CIA, how the drug trade replaced socialism in Jamaica. This is about Michael Manley. And we have a clip now that goes to his role in non-aligned foreign policy. We're going to play it, and then we're going to go to Abby Martin in a minute.
And he did implement a series of reforms. Land reform, he expanded education programs, he eliminated discrimination for children born out of wedlock, and implemented other significant reforms. In 1975, Agostinho Neto's Marxist-oriented popular movement for the liberation of Angola led Angola to a hard-fought independence. Almost immediately, the South African apartheid regime invaded. Fidel Castro offered his aid, but the well-trained and equipped Cuban forces were an ocean away. Cuban forces needed to refuel on their way to Angola, and Manley, along with Forbes Burnham in Guyana and Errol Barrow in Barbados, agreed to provide landing bases and diplomatic cover for the Cuban forces. Washington objected strongly to this, and Henry Kissinger went personally to see Manley and demand that his government withdraw support. He declined Kissinger's request and pushed Kissinger's hand out of his face. This, along with...
Definitely, so become a patron. And for everybody, go to our illicit history playlist, and you'll find out the other playlists we have, like a UK election playlist, Richard Wolff playlist, and many others. We're going to take a brief break, and we're going to come right back with the great Abby Martin on the Michael Brooks Show. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now, and it's been a long time coming, it's time for her to be on, Abby Martin. She is the creator and host of the Empire Files, host of Media Roots Radio, and also the director of, really, guys, I can't emphasize enough how great and important this documentary is. I was privileged enough to go to a showing of it in New York, Gaza Fights for Freedom. Abby, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Michael. It's a great honor.
So Abby, first, right out of the gate, I just want to play a little bit of the trailer for Gaza Fights for Freedom, and then you're going to tell us about this movie. And I just want to like say on the upfront that, I mean, I was excited to see it because I really respect your work. And, you know, it's an area that there's plenty of people who know a lot more than me, but I do know something about. And I already, like, you know, in the sense that, like, I don't have any illusions about what Israel is doing in Gaza, as an example. You know, I don't watch Barry Weiss and go, wow, that's a really interesting perspective. But this movie, what I'm trying to say is that even if you are up on this and you're aware of it, it's still an incredibly important documentary to watch. So let's play the first, I think about a minute of this trailer, and then we'll go to you, Abby.
هذه بنتنا ورزان بمثابة كانت بنتي الكبيرة أول فرحتي يعني أول شابة مسعفة ميدانية متطوعة كانت هي أول شابة كشابة يعني كفتاة تنزل على المخيمات العودة والكل بادر فيها وشارك فيها أنا كمان شاركت كل البيت شارك زوجي وأولادي وجيراني وإخواني كل العالم يعني كل الفلسطينيين شاركوا مش أكتر هي صح رايحة وبعدين مسيرتنا مسيرة سلمية ما احنا حاملين سلاح ولا إشي بالعكس احنا بصدورنا العارية أمام قوة كبيرة من الجيش اللي هي مدرعاتهم وأسلحتهم وغازهم وطائراتهم احنا مسيرتنا سلمية بنطالب بحقنا من حق يكون أنا لي بلد من حق يكون لي بيت من حق المتشردين في كل مكان هذول النازعين يجوا على بيوتهم.
Abby, tell us about this documentary. What brought you to it, and what's the story of Gaza?
Right. So back in 2016, my partner Mike Preisner and I, who co-produced the documentary, we were on the ground in the occupied West Bank, and you know that's a horrifying situation. It's under brutal martial law. So it's kind of a joke that Israel is called the greatest democracy in the Middle East when you know how you have about 5.5 million Palestinians whose lives are controlled by Israel who cannot participate in this so-called democracy. So anyway, while we were on the ground doing reports for Empire Files, we wanted to get into Gaza. We had all the proper paperwork, we filled out all the right credentials, and we were outright banned by the Foreign Press Office under Netanyahu by being told that we were propagandists and not journalists, and also with the allegation that I was an Iranian agent. I'm being used to a Russian agent, so that was really perplexing to me. But a year and a half or 2 years after that, the Great March of Return sparked off, which of course, you know, was the brainchild of this one activist, Ahmed Abu Artema, who basically just wanted to do a nonviolent mass civil disobedience, basically akin to Occupy Wall Street, you know, pitch tents in this open land, right across the fence that partitions them from the land that they were ethnically cleansed from, in a nonviolent action, bared chests, and it sparked off this huge mobilization of tens of thousands of Palestinians who have been going out there every Friday for the last year and a half. Now, this is all sparked, of course, from a growing humanitarian crisis that Gaza has been suffering for quite a long time. I would say since, you know, the Israeli military left after the election in before the election in 2006, and since then, after Hamas took over, they've been collectively punished under a medieval siege which deprives them of water, electricity, and basic mobility. So people are suffering in a dire fashion. I mean, half of the people who are living there are children. 75% are refugees. And there's just an economic chokehold that is causing extreme unemployment and just general, you know, human suffering, Michael. And we know that this region is just collectively punished, depriving people of getting medical treatment, and also just bombed relentlessly under the guise that everyone's a terrorist and everyone's a Hamas target.
Absolutely. And I mean, I don't even want to spend that much time on Hamas. I mean, I've talked about it a bit on this show. It's worth being real about Hamas and complexifying Hamas. But one of the things that is so important about this documentary that I think people had a sense of, but you just hit home so perfectly, is that, well, number one, the laziest, constant, I'm trying not to get comedic here, but I mean, the Israeli, yeah, we let this baby on fire, but it was a Hamas operative. I mean, just like any clip of anything, like, oh, no, you can't, we got to contextualize why we had to shoot this 5-year-old in the face, Hamas, right? Combined with the fact, just as like the most hack propaganda tool that is always used in an Israeli context, no matter what the crime they've committed, but also that this movement really was not a product of any type of political fiefdom or political bosses, therefore not of Hamas.
Right, and Gaza's kind of painted cartoonishly as all Hamas because they won the democratic election, but I mean, there's a mosaic of political factions. The Communist Party is actually a very giant political force. I would say the second biggest political force in the region. And again, the Great March, even though it had affiliates from various political groups, it was primarily led by unaffiliated academics, artists, and activists. And it started off as kind of a festive occasion, which is just unbelievable how, these people were met with sniper fire. The first day of the Great March, on March 30th, 2018, they started using live ammunition against these people at 9 a.m. And over the course of that day, 18 people were shot dead. And keep in mind that these snipers had a wide view of the demonstrations, and they're just picking people off. I mean, this is unlike any other conflict or clash really anywhere in the world. You can't really compare it to a war zone because these people were just there, standing there protesting, some holding flags, a lot of people filming, and they were just targeted, directly assassinated, a lot of them shot in the head or torso. And not only we focus on the humanization of Palestinians, these are among the most dehumanized people in the entire world. And you mentioned this kind of slick PR operation that's funded, with millions and millions of dollars every single year. And these Israeli officials are deployed that look and sound just like me and you, Michael, and they're deployed on corporate media to just excuse and absolve these atrocities with the most cartoonish and obscene propaganda ever. Everyone's a human shield. Everyone wants to die, and therefore everything is justified no matter what happens. And it's just absolutely atrocious. So we frame the entire documentary on this UN commission and in the framework of international law, because we really wanted to make a clear-cut case of how many violations were actually made.
Right. And talk more about the humanization. That's so important. There's so many people in the film, and maybe in this answer you could weave in how you got all this mind-blowingly good footage and really powerful interviews. But humanization, and by the way, in direct contrast, and I know you guys did this, I know you did this consciously, but every piece of propaganda, like you just said, they want to die. They're human shields. They believe in paradise more than this life, and all of these cliches. I think almost every single person that you interviewed in this film said some version of, I want to live.
Yeah, Michael, and all the footage kind of arose from this Skype session that I had with about 30 Gaza journalists after the Great March sparked off, and we just were absolutely shocked and appalled by the abhorrent corporate media distortions of the march and the relentless slandering of Palestinians, despite this being such a different action. And they told me, when we agreed to do this collaboration, they said, can you please tell Americans that we want to live? And how shocking is that that's something that you actually have to relay to an audience, that these people want to live, they have families, and we open and close the documentary with a story of one man who just kind of goes through average life in Gaza, and we end with the story of Razan al-Najjar to give homage to what a hero she was. And we could have done that for any of the statistics. I mean, there's such a broad view of all these statistics, and all of them have a story just like Razan and Ahmad, because they all have families that are suffering. They all have friends that are still weeping over the loss of their colleagues. And it's absolutely the most cynical, disgusting talking point that you can say. And it's literally been used. You look at like conflicts of, in U.S. warfare back to the Vietnam War, back to World War II, and we've always used that term human shield to basically dehumanize whatever population we're unleashing atrocities upon. It's very, very sick.
As a final part of this part of what we're talking about, and again, everybody, Gaza Fights for Freedom, please watch it. Maybe, Abby, you could tell people how they could find it. But if there was one, I mean, you do use a lot of examples of the people you're talking about in the film, of the propaganda that gets deployed on behalf of Israel, no matter what atrocities the Israeli state is committing against purely nonviolent protesters. Like there isn't even like, this is a case that does not involve any debate about, well, what is somebody's right to defend itself under international law? All of this stuff that people get into, which are important conversations. Sure, whatever. This is purely people going out and doing nonviolent demonstrating. And you're talking also about, medics, journalists, children, as you said, just getting picked off and murdered casually by Israeli soldiers in a systemic way. What would be the one piece of propaganda that you see deployed in defense of this policy? Like if there was the one core thing you could debunk, what would that be?
I think that there's a couple things. That it's all engineered by Hamas and everyone's a Hamas target. I mean, you look at documents that Ilan Pape and other historians have provided from the Nakba and beyond about the prevention of infiltration law, that there was a shoot to kill order employed basically against quote-unquote infiltrators, which meant refugees who were expelled that wanted to return. So this policy has been in place for 70 years, Michael. It's just been morphed over time to justify now that, first it was infiltrators, now it's terrorists. So this whole mantra that, Hamas is this dangerous terrorist organization, therefore we have the right to just shoot to kill anyone who nears this partitioned, militarized fence, is shocking, because this has been a policy that extends far beyond Hamas and far beyond anything else. So that is first and foremost, and of course you just hear from the organizers themselves, the participants of the march themselves, and you look at just the wide swaths of the scores of civilians, victims, that we interview a lot of them in the film, and you can tell firsthand they are not Hamas. They have nothing to do with Hamas. And so we're really honored to kind of amplify those voices. The second propaganda piece is that everyone who's participating in the march wants to go and kill Israelis. Again, hear from the organizers themselves that this was a symbolic action, and that it was basically just mounted to get international pressure, galvanize international pressure to draw attention to the fact that these people are still refugees 70 years later. And it was always supposed to be a peaceful action. And so to paint it like this, and I think Israel has this kind of habit where they just keep putting out like cartoon Hasbro cartoons, like, showing people holding like rocket launchers and giant like slingshots that look like boulders and stuff. And they're like, this is what, Palestinians or Hamas brings to a protest, and this is what Americans bring to a protest. It's like, first of all, like, why are you speaking specifically to an American audience? That's always curious to me. But it's just so easy to debunk. You just look at the footage, and we went through 12 hours of this footage, Michael, and we didn't see one weapon, and you can see that reflected in the UN report that, not one Israeli soldier was killed or seriously wounded, and only 4 claimed scratches from thrown rocks to really justify this ongoing massacre.
Absolutely. So I guess related, obviously, but switching gears a little bit, you have done so much important work, and I feel a kinship actually in the work in terms of telling the story in such a vivid way of American empire as a bipartisan project, as a world systems, as a capitalist project of exploitation, of arms sales, of resource acquisition. I've heard some people say, that they take Donald Trump's tweets at face value, and that even though Donald Trump is, a massive asshole, and even though he's kidnapping and terrorizing children, and even though he's a white supremacist, and even though he's a misogynist, and even though He is pushing through every type of extreme Republican policy on the environment, on taxes, trying to gut healthcare. The dude, at the very least, is opposed to militarism and empire. Abby, you created the Empire Files. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, this is incredible, and I really respect your work as well, because I feel like a lot of people have kind of bad takes on foreign policy and also just Trump's foreign policy specifically. You have a lot of people pushing him from the right on corporate media and kind of from the establishment blob whenever he, does certain things like announces troop withdrawals or announces kind of diplomatic relations with countries like the DPRK. And then you have a lot of people who literally take his rhetoric at face value. Like you just said, he tweets endless wars must end, and people are like, oh my God, he's an anti-interventionist, anti-war guy, based on nothing at all. I mean, he presented himself during the campaign trail as a heartless warmonger who literally thought the violence of the war machine was too restrained. He stacked his cabinet with the craziest neocon outliers, ones even too insane for the Bush administration, and more generals than any other cabinet since World War II, a lot of them literal war criminals. I mean, then you can get into Venezuela, the coup, the sanctions. Sanctions alone, he has deployed the most catastrophic sanctions out of any president in modern history. 40,000 people dead in Venezuela under Trump since 2017. 150 at least sanctions added to Iran after upending the nuclear deal. North Korea, Syria, Libya, throwing dozens of sanctions on those countries. Nicaragua, Cuba, under the troika of tyranny. And that's just sanctions alone, Michael, but I think people don't realize how devastating sanctions really are. And then you look at the troop deployments, right? I mean, the Syria troop deployment and Afghanistan, which he was credited for removing troops and ending the wars, he himself added those troops that he was removing. He literally put 10 times the amount of troops in Syria that Obama left with. And then he withdraws a couple hundred, leaves a couple hundred more to protect the oil very brazenly, and then just stations the rest of the troops in Iraq for this perpetual occupation that he also added and nearly doubled the amount of U.S. troops that were in Iraq. And don't forget the Mosul massacre in Iraq that possibly killed 500 civilians at once. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. The drone strikes, I mean, I was the first to call Obama the drone king, but Trump has literally tripled drone strikes in every region of the world, and he's killed a massive amount of civilian casualties, increased by 215%. Syria, Iraq, Somalia. He campaigned on bombing the shit out of terrorists and their families, and he definitely kept that promise.
Right.
And this just goes on and on and on. So it is mind-numbing. It is mind-numbing that people do not have an honest assessment, and I guess just don't take the time to really realize the damage that he is doing to expand and cement the empire, not to mention the nearly $1 trillion defense budget and this expansion of this ridiculous space force.
Right. Can't forget the space, right. NASA. NASA's too soft. But even that is, I mean, look, that's the deployment of space weapons. I mean, that goes back to Star Wars and the fantasies of the Reagan administration, which they're fantasies, but they have real budgets and contracts attached to them. And also this guy sits with, MBS and brags about how many weapons he's selling them. And the other part I just want to make on this, I mean, you outlined that all beautifully, right? But it's like, I think it's also a reminder too, we all got so used to, particularly with Obama, of like, well, that's a great speech, but look what you're doing in Yemen, right? This sort of thing. And that's 100% right. But I think people really overcorrected to, well, ironically, on one hand, either taking Trump at face value, which is ridiculous, or two, kind of being like, actually saying what Bashar al-Assad said the other day, which is like, he's a great president because he says what he wants, which, okay, great. Bashar al-Assad, I'm sorry, is obviously a war criminal as well, as pretty much every single faction in Syria is, with the exception of the Kurds, in my view. But regardless, that on a cultural level, it actually does matter on some level, right? We can call it Obama for hypocrisy and contradiction, but when he, or George W. Bush even for that matter, comes out on television and says, look, at least on the minimum level of like, you know what, don't harass somebody on the street because they're Muslim. We'll do that because we'll spy on them and put them in Guantanamo, right? But the implication of what Trump is doing, even on that cultural level, when he does say, yeah, I want to bomb the shit out of them, that actually matters. Like it matters in the same way that, yes, is America a profoundly racist country? Absolutely. But does it matter when the president, as a top-down fashion, says that, like, no, there's good people in Charlottesville? Yeah, it actually does. So there's a cultural diffusion here, too, that I get why people don't like to talk in those terms because of the hypocrisy and the bullshit, but it matters.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, for a period of time, I was like, yeah, this is really fascinating that he's kind of lifting the mask of empire. And just like Assad said, you know, it's the most transparent presidency I guess we've ever had, even though he's, you know, closing the amount of troop withdrawals and also the civilian death count. He actually has closed that number off. But yeah, I think that rhetoric absolutely has real world consequences. And you can see that with incitement of violence, the mass shootings done in Trump's name. I mean, just the right-wing attacks alone in this country. Absolutely this has effects, and it's absolutely devastating. It is devastating. And people think that this is funny, and they're like, oh, I love that Trump just says what he's thinking, and he's just really honest. It's like, no, he's a con artist, and you've all been conned if you're playing into this.
Right. And he can still be funny at times. You just have to know what he is. I have to defend myself. If somebody was sitting watching this and they saw me co-sign on saying it's fully not funny, they would have to call bullshit on me. But I do agree with your broader point 100%. But Abby, we've got an answer. There's a great anti-imperialist congresswoman who's never said anything weird about Islamic terrorism or never had any ambiguous positions on torture, who never went to go see Netanyahu when most even people like Tim Kaine boycotted his speech in the U.S. Congress to try to undermine Obama's Iran deal, which is the best thing Obama ever did. Tulsi Gabbard, right?
Right. Let me start by saying, I appreciate some things she's brought to the table, right? Opposing sanctions, regime change wars, quote unquote, while calling to pardon whistleblowers like Assange. But as an anti-imperialist and anti-war journalist, I think the most important framework to oppose war is the perpetual war on terror that was cemented by Bush and expanded under Obama. I mean, this is drone bombings, this is the extrajudicial assassinations that can be carried out anywhere. And instead of alleging that radical Islamic terrorism is the fundamental threat, I mean, I'd rather address that much of the terrorism committed is a direct blowback from U.S. foreign policy, which is terrorism itself. Like Chomsky said, if you want to stop terrorism, stop committing terrorism. I mean, look at bin Laden, who said that U.S. bases and troops in Saudi Arabia fueled his rage against the U.S. Look at al-Baghdadi, tortured in Abu Ghraib. ISIS grew out of the vacuum of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. I mean, it's strange to me, I think, aside from all of that, which I disagree with her fundamentally on, and I think our bar is set very low for what is considered anti-war, anti-imperialism in the mainstream discourse, I find it very strange that Tulsi Gabbard is running against Bernie Sanders. That, to me, is why I dislike her the most. Why is she running against Bernie? Why is Elizabeth Warren running against Bernie? If they cared about defeating Trump, they would not be running against Bernie Sanders. And also, it's weird that she just said she's not running for Congress anymore. I mean, if she cares about fighting the entrenched and corrupt Democratic establishment, why is this an all-or-nothing thing to win the presidency? I find that very strange. Not to mention the pivoting on Medicare for all, where all these people are now poisoning the well on what that even means, the Medicare choice. This is a country that is beholden to corporations. We are uniquely captured by corporate power. This Medicare choice thing is not gonna work here. So I don't understand why we can't just be honest and clear. And unfortunately, a lot of the critiques from her are coming from dishonest actors, where it's being framed the wrong way. Because to me, I would like a lot more left critique about these issues that you and others have done.
I agree with you completely. And I'll underline again, even though, I mean, you know, for people who can't deal with any criticism for her, she's 100% right on Julian Assange, and the charges against him are a fundamental threat to journalism everywhere, and particularly to great journalists like Abby, frankly, who do, you know, analogous work. I'll add, I've noted this on other streams, but I'll just note quickly, regardless of what you think of his work and where you come in, it doesn't matter. The arrest of Max Blumenthal is a major threat and a major danger, and also, I have no doubt, cooked up by far-right Venezuelan opposition forces. So, and she was right to oppose regime change efforts in Venezuela. She's been right on a variety of issues. But the thing is that it's not, and she's also been radically wrong on a variety of issues, and it's not structural at all, like you're saying. And Sanders, you know, again, people always nitpick. Yes, he did not shoulder like every single wrong for decades, right? Like I think there was an element of like Bernie is totally isolated in modern politics. For decades, he's basically the only person saying that like poor people are human beings, as an example. And maybe he goes along to get along on certain foreign policy issues. I think that's totally a fair critique, but you should historicize that critique. On the other hand, this is a guy who is tweeting out solidarity with people in Haiti and Chile and calling for freeing Lula today, who voted against 3 military budget increases today, where Warren voted for each of them and Tulsi voted for at least one of them. And Gabbard has had nothing to say on the solidarity and justice front. And I just also want to play this video because I do think you can't escape the fact that you go back to the Syrian refugee vote, the fact that when she first got any kind of public attention, it was like obsessively like going on TV to complain that Obama wouldn't call it Islamic terrorism. And I just want to contextualize this a little bit. This is a video she just put out. And Erdogan obviously has played a horrible role across the Middle East. And particularly, you know, in Turkey, now slaughtering the Kurds, and definitely, I would say, I don't think he tolerated and has supported ISIS, and at other times fought ISIS, right? Like that's how complicated and twisted the situation is there. So my problem here is not her attacking Erdogan, but the way she frames this is bizarre. And it sounds like something out of like, well, Breitbart. Check this out.
Good morning, everybody. I'm getting ready for National Guard duty this morning, but wanted to take a minute to mention something that's been in the news lately. Turkey's President Erdogan, as you know, is invading Syria, slaughtering the Syrian Kurds, and he's using terrorists from ISIS and Al-Qaeda as his militia. Now, this is something I've been warning about for years, that Erdogan's been assisting ISIS and other so-called jihadists in their quest to overthrow the Syrian government and establish a so-called Islamic caliphate. Erdogan's denied this for years, but the fact that he is now openly and brazenly creating militias of radical Islamists, including so-called former ISIS and Al-Qaeda terrorists, exposes him for what he is. He's a radical Islamist megalomaniac whose goal is to establish an Islamist caliphate with himself as the caliph, the supreme ruler.
I'm sorry, I was being so serious. What the fuck is she talking about? She could say neo-Ottoman. That's wild shit.
And before she goes to National Guard duty. I mean, again, it's like the fact that Trump can just activate her, you know, and be like, all right, you're deployed. Like, it's just like, what is going on here?
Right.
I mean, I think the point is that she's not, that's just cartoonish. And, you know, I think that, again, it shows a fundamental flaw in her worldview, that this is about radical Islamic terrorism driving these movements. And we know that that's kind of a really narrow and, frankly, right-wing viewpoint. And again, I think that she should really quit the military, because if you want to paint yourself as an anti-war, even remotely anti-war candidate, I don't understand why you are in an active duty military service. I find that very strange as well.
Right.
I mean, and also, has she even denounced the military budget and talked about, the need to maybe she has, but again, I mean, back
she
to the
has
point
in
about
some
Bernie.
way. I mean, she's voted mixed ways. She sometimes talks about military spending, the military-industrial complex. But even there, I would say there's a, look, anytime you make a statement like this, I'm sure that she's said military-industrial complex. I know it's sometimes she's talked about civilian casualties, but the overwhelming focus is on this notion of wasting resources and things that are in the U.S. national interest or not. And this other dynamic that you have here is a very strange view of Islam, which I don't, look, I don't like to super go in this direction, but people can look up her family's guru and what the guy said about Muslims. It's not that hard to find. And, this is somebody who yes, she spent time in the Middle East. She has a certain understanding from a military standpoint, but I don't think she spent that much time figuring out what the difference between Shia or Sunni is, or the difference between political movements. Like even you were just saying, like, does she know that the Communist Party is a force in Gaza? I profoundly doubt it. And also look at her comments on, Kashmir, and then look at actually, in fact, how the small band of people that, follow her, they start, all of a sudden I see people who, maybe they thought Pakistan was like a restaurant, all of a sudden talking about ISI agents infiltrating India, which, by the way, that is an issue. But when I see people who have no basis for talking about any of these things, all of a sudden echoing the most extreme Indian foreign policy talking points, and it would be absolutely the same if it was somebody echoing the most extreme ISI Pakistani talking points. That's not the point. Is not the country. The point is the location of the policy, and it's very bizarre that she's a conduit for that. And I agree. Look, of course, everybody besides Bernie is bullshit, and I think that critique applies equally. But it's very weird to see how, especially as Bernie, I mean, you have Ilhan Omar saying he's going to end Western imperialism in front of his speech. I don't know, like, I didn't expect to hear that shit. I don't know what more people, we want policy, but you know what I'm saying.
Right. I mean, Bernie, again, he has proven himself for decades. He was a member of the Progressive Caucus when Elizabeth Warren was still a Republican, and when Tulsi Gabbard was in, a cult that's a very vehemently homophobic and anti-Islam cult. Right. So I think it's just really important to kind of attach and hitch our wagons to the person that we can rely on, and who is also, most importantly, Michael, making this about us, the organizer in chief. This is not about him. This is about us mobilizing ourselves, pushing these policies through, because there is no savior 2020. Bernie is the most likely candidate that will be able to represent the masses wherever we move ourselves and push him forward to do. And that is the most important thing about this election. And I do not see anyone else waiting in the wings that can possibly take up the mantle to prove himself the way that Bernie Sanders has over the last 40 years, whether it be LGBTQ rights, whether it be fighting the military-industrial complex, fighting on behalf of veterans. The list goes on and on and on. And that's who I trust. And it's kind of shocking that progressives are so confused in this election, because we have so much at stake. We have so much at stake, and Trump needs to be beaten. And there's only one candidate that can really get that done.
Abby, I agree with you 1,000%. I want everybody to follow the links we put in to watch Gaza Fights For Freedom. It's an incredibly important documentary. Check out the Empire Files, Media Roots. And Abby, I think you and I are going to do a lot more stuff together. I really appreciate your time.
You rock, man. Thanks so much, Michael. I really appreciate it.
Take care.
Bye.
All right, folks. It is time for a gem, and then this just indispensable interview with the great Adolph Reed Jr. But first, David Griscom, what do we got?
Yeah, so this week I really wanted to talk about microfinancing, and specifically microcredit. Some folks might be familiar with this. It was a major fetish. It's basically been a fetish of a lot of development economics for like 30 years now. The idea is that people in poor and deprived communities from around the world, they're not, poor and deprived because of capitalism or imperialism or American exploitation. They're poor because they just haven't been incorporated well enough into the international finance system. So what happens is people are basically given, small loans for small amounts of money, maybe to us, so that they can start their own business, right? But what often happens is that people are not able to make the payments. They're putting up a very small amount of collateral, which is very dear to them, and then they end up finding themselves massively in debt with no real economic advancement. There's been some major scandals with this. In 2007, Mexico's largest microcredit bank was found to be seriously profiteering off of microcredit. They were charging people rates that were near 100% annually for very small loans. So the idea behind microcredit is very neoliberal, is that we can create all these different kinds of entrepreneurs in economically deprived communities. Essentially, they want to give people credit so that they can buy goods, hopefully very cheaply, and then sell them very high. But if you do that in a community that doesn't have a lot of economic activity, where a lot of people are very poor, it does not create a lot of opportunity. What happens is, if it's successful, the person who's selling those goods now drives out all of the other small people, all the other small business owners, which basically in its best case scenario just means that, some person creates a business and creates a few jobs, but then the equal amount of people end up losing their jobs. So that it's sort of like a net zero gain, right? It just is a transfer of one person being able to have a little bit of money versus another. What often happens, though, is that people are not able to make these payments, and that there is massive, devastation, and money is just extracted from already very poor communities. So imagine, a small community that's been devastated by imperialism and colonialism. Now there's not a lot of economic activity. Now this is a great way for the international finance system to be able to suck out the last little bit of economic assets that belong to these small communities. The reason I want to talk about this is because I read a really upsetting story over the weekend, which is in Washington Post. I highly suggest people check it out, called The Migrant Debt Cycle. And it tells a story about a small town in Guatemala where people frequently are going into debt to pay human smugglers to get into the United States. Now, obviously, this is illegal, but the institutions there are very aware of what's happening and are approving a significant amount of them. One of the whistleblowers who came out and spoke to the reporter said that they think about 30% of their daily operations are actually giving people, these small loans that they're giving to human smugglers. Now, this creates a really horrible cycle of debt. One, just so people can understand the kind of money we're talking about. People are paying like $12,000 to get smuggled into the United States. What happens oftentimes is they try to get into the United States. They've put up everything that they have back home to be able to fund, getting into the United States. Then they get deported. So what often happens is people double down. So then they pay a smuggler again, and then they'll encourage family members to take out a loan so that they can pay the smuggler again to get them back into the United States. Now, the reason that they're doing this, as we all know, is because when you have massive amount of capital flows into the United States from the rest of the world, that creates massive human flows because people need to be able to find money to support their lives. In Guatemala, workers are going to make 7 times as much more if they're working low-wage jobs in the United States than they can in their communities. So what's happening here is, massive amounts of debt, massive amounts of profiteering on the backs of some of the most marginal people. And, if you go into these towns in Guatemala, they're peppered with ads for these businesses. I mean, it's a really cynical abuse of people who desperately need help. And it also shows the fundamental failure of the neoliberal model of development, focusing so much on the individual and the responsibility of the individual rather than a collective understanding of economics and how to create a community that can thrive, just creates more systems of debt. So the idea here, the hope here in this best system is that you're giving someone an opportunity to start a small business. And if they fail, well, that's on them. As we see across the board, the conditions are not viable for most people to be able to take advantage of these loans, and they just find themselves in debt. If we wanted to have a real radical economic platform, it would definitely be about community investment rather than trying to focus so much on the individual and the atomized version of politics that we're seeing pushed onto the rest of the world. When you see these stories, this desperately is the crisis of capitalism and imperialism, and it's something that we desperately need to be getting rid of in liberal circles as an idea of a way that helps out the globe, because it was really creating us a lot of pain and suffering. And just real quick, a lot of people in this field actually are very much like terrorized by the NGOs and the social apparatus that really tries to push microlending as a solution for poverty, that is really understudied the economic effects of it. So you get a lot of like really messed up reports that are, praising it, but it's not talking about all the damage that's going on in Africa and in Latin America and in India.
Absolutely. I mean, look, the Clinton Global Initiative is all over microcredit. What more do you need to know? All right, folks, I just want to say, first of all, shouts to David. He's here. I promised you a shout out. David is an extremely talented photographer. He's also fellow at MR. So he's here. Nando Vila is coming for the post-game, guys. Become a patron today. This interview with Adolph Reed, again, I keep saying it, could not be more important. Unlock so you can get the heads up, the Zizek interview is still behind the play wall. But watch this Adolph Reed interview and share it far and wide. This stuff is really important. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now, and it really is a great honor. I won't lay it on too thick because he's a Catholic gentleman, in inclination, if not belief. Adolph Reed Jr. He's a professor emeritus at the University of Pennsylvania. I want to hold up this book, Class Notes, which I'm rereading right now, and I recommend everybody read as a matter of some urgency. Also, a pretty high entertainment value, I have to confess, and a forthcoming book tentatively titled, and I'm sorry, Professor Reed, I've already spaced it. Will you tell us?
Oh, yeah, sure. It's Decline and Transformation of the U.S. Left.
Decline and Transformation of the U.S. Left. Professor Adolph Reed Jr., thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure, Michael. Definitely.
So can you talk about, let's just get right into it. Okay. Why is this professional managerial class, why is this back in our consciousness? And how does it reflect about the specific synergy of neoliberalism and essentialism that you've long warned about?
Wow. Yeah, well, that's seems like at the moment that's a $64 question, which certainly ages me. But well, I mean, one thing about the PMC is that it's first of all, our class, right? I mean, to be honest, it's the class that most of us belong to, people. So to that extent, right, there's concern with trying to figure out how the different strata that make up this social formation of people who are, who largely live by their intellectual production, right? Like in the one way or another, professionals, managers, academics, journalists, and so forth and so on. And I guess that the notion has gotten popular again in the left circles that it's gotten popular in, partly because trying to figure out, in part because, frankly, of the Warren-Sanders dichotomy, partly also because of trying to of the sort of ongoing and maybe even deepening tension between different strains of people who understand themselves to be progressives or leftists in the U.S. now. I think it's bound up with the ongoing debate over the primacy of material agendas versus symbolic or identity-based agendas, and that's really not even a fair way to characterize it. It's a partisan way because I'm sure that people on the other side of that divide would argue that the identitarian agendas or programs or concerns are also material. It's clearly a debate that's kind of raging within DSA now, but I'm not a member of DSA and don't follow it that closely. The technocratic wing of the Democratic Party and even the technocratic wing of the left wing or element of the left wing of the Democratic Party, and debates over, again, it goes back in part, as I said, to the Sanders versus Warren dichotomy, God, I mean, this is another hoary debate among intellectuals, but the recognition versus redistribution debate that Nancy Fraser and Judith Butler and other people, like that, were engaged in the 90s or maybe even the late 80s. The decades kind of blur together as you get older. So, I mean, all these, I think all these are factors that have kind of pushed this idea back up to the forefront again, or back up on the surface rather, of some strains of leftist debate, and there's something going on that's like bigger than the little eddies that people like me live in. Because I noticed a couple of years ago that Barbara and John Ehrenreich had done a piece for the Rosa Luxemburg Institute, revisiting the idea of the PMC, and I noticed just today that she's, I think it was an interview. Yes, it's an interview that she has in Dissent, revisiting the concept. Part of it, and I'll shut up because then I'm running off at the mouth, but part of it too is connected with how we want to think about class politics and how we want to think about social transformation and what counts as social transformation. Some people, will say how we think about socialism and concerns over the technocratic or concerns prompted by understanding of the technocratic concern, or rather the technocratic shift of most of the Western social democratic parties in the decades after World War II and how that turned out.
Yeah, I think, there's a part of it that you've responded to. There was a piece in N+1, which, fair enough. I don't think it was terribly interesting, that sort of making the point that you said right at the outset, which is if you're in media advocating for any candidate, you're kind of definitionally part of this PMC. Sure, there's folks like me who support Bernie Sanders very strongly, and we, kind of enjoy making fun of people who get a big, a lot of sort of adrenal rush because of Elizabeth Warren's Medium posts. And, fair enough. We're professional. We're PMC too. My answer is not very material, which is that PMC is a state of mind, and that's what we're critiquing. That's, sort of the point. I mean, you and I were just exchanging a little bit back and forth on Brazil. I had the pleasure of interviewing, Celso Amorim, who was Lula da Silva's foreign minister, as people, and I mean, sure, this is he and Lula were joined at the hip. Lula's this extraordinary working class president. Celso's a highly educated, multilingual diplomat, but their mindset was the same. I think that's kind of what we're getting to. The other things that I just want to inject in the conversation that I really would like you to delineate for us, because you also have a great piece in the New Republic called "The Myth of Economic Reductionism," and I feel like there's 3 or 4 things, and I'll try to be as concise as possible, but they seem to all get knotted up. So one is a piece of history that you point out, and most people like to ignore, which is that insofar as there is a representation in politics of so-called, I mean, we wouldn't say class or left in the authentic sense, but say people in the Democratic side or the labor side of politics who wanted to explicitly appeal to racism or demagoguery or pretend that those issues didn't exist, that would be the Clinton and Tony Blair third way of the 1990s.
Isn't that ironic,
right?
By the way?
Absolutely. Yeah. So that the people who follow in that tradition, there was actually Democratic presidents who, demonized poor people of color, who advocated, David Blunkett, who was Tony Blair's home minister, called migrants. He called it dumping on our country. Right. That's one thread. Yeah. And then the other 2 things that I think are valuable to distinguish. Then there's the one that kind of is floating in the air, which is an obsession with technical expertise as like an end in and of itself, which I think, is very reflective. And then there's this tension between And I think the most useful debate is, so I learn a hell of a lot from you, and I learn a hell of a lot from Bill Fletcher Jr., who is also, a socialist. And when I hear Bill Fletcher Jr., he might, you guys might have different perceptions of things like reparations and so on, but he's still talking about overcoming white supremacy as part of a socialist project, not as a negation of cross-boundary unity, which is how it is primarily deployed in these conversations. So I know that's a lot, but I just wanted to kind of set the playing field, and maybe you could elaborate in any way you want.
Sure. Well, let me start out with the first because this gives me a rare opportunity to set the record straight about something. Because I've heard, I've seen. I should preface this by saying that I'm not really on social media at all. Like, I spent about
lucky you
2 or 3 months on Facebook a number of years ago, and it felt like a back door to my life was open. And then I shut it down. Right?
Lucky, yes.
So I've never been on Twitter, so any of that. So I don't.
You do have a very active Instagram page.
Oh, I had no idea.
I'm
Seriously?
just kidding. I'm joking.
Oh, okay. Thank God for that.
No, it's absolutely a joke.
Okay, good.
Yes.
But I've gotten wind from time to time. Other people have pointed out to me that there's a line out there somewhere that once upon a time I used to care about racism, but I don't anymore.
Right.
And here's the thing, right? Like, so I came out of the left, and after Reagan was elected in 1980, and a little nearer the mark, once it became clear that Reagan wasn't going to be another version of Nixon, and was really serious, I decided, okay, well, this means that I need to rethink, how I relate to liberals, and I was at that point part of a general intellectual tendency that included people like Francis Fox Piven and Michael K. Brown, and later on, Jill Quadagno and others, who had begun with a left, trying to fashion a left critique of the American welfare state. And then by the time that we thought we were getting someplace with it, the Reaganites launched their attack on it, followed by the formation of the Democratic Leadership Council in 1985. So then people like us turned to defending the welfare state. Then by the late 80s, we start getting that, the emergence of that tendency around Clinton that you mentioned initially. Clinton and, frankly, William Julius Wilson and others. Paul Starr, for instance, had an article in an early issue of the American Prospect where he openly and explicitly yearned to for American politics to go back to the 40s, before race became an issue. So that then led people like me to attack Clinton, Wilson, and others of that ilk for precisely the way that they tried to use race in the form of demonizing mainly poor people of color, right? Poor mainly people of color, right? As an image with this rhetoric like playing by the rules and the truly needy and all the rest of that stuff, while at the same time wanting to show that they were tough on crime and so forth and so on. And that's when that same group of people plus others who were younger and newer and maybe even smarter began to articulate a critique that showed that contemporary racial economic inequalities, some strains of contemporary racial inequalities, had their roots, at least part, in a discriminatory implementation of what supposedly had been universalistic programs earlier, right? But then what happens then is because history doesn't stop rolling, and
Professor,
late 90s.
Oh, sorry. You cut out for just a moment. Sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Well, yes. I said what happened was that since history keeps rolling.
Yes, please.
By the end of the 90s and early 2000s, or like into the 2000s, like at least by the Obama presidency, all of a sudden this sort of right wing of the Democratic Party, right technocratic wing of the Democratic Party that had sought to get ideological leverage by beating up on poor black people with a sleight of hand, all of a sudden switch gears, as it were, and become the avatars of an identitarian rhetoric that projects the same kind of partial technocratic right-wing approach like to social policy and to social justice, and that culminates then in 2016 with Hillary Clinton making that infamous statement that if you break up the big banks, I mean, that wouldn't do anything about racism. And to which I said no, and it wouldn't cure the heartbreak of psoriasis either, but it would be a way to start trying to make most working people's lives of whatever color or gender.
You don't remember MLK's infamous, the war in Vietnam, stopping it would not help integrate a lunch counter?
No, I guess I must have slept that day.
Whoa.
So, anyway, that's what I would say about the first point, right?
Right.
I'm not sure that's quite on the mark. But
no, I just want to really echo. This is almost embarrassing to do it, but the notion that anybody who's read your work with comprehension capacity and non-cynicism would. The fundamental commitment to anti-racism and anti-essentialism is the through line, but maybe there again is the distinction between what you would call essentialism and what like the African National Congress would call non-racialism. But at any rate, keep going, please. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Well, no. I don't know. That makes sense to me. But I would also point out, and I think this connects, with the other points too, that there's this tendency to overlook the fact that from the mid-1930s until well into the 60s, serious civil rights advocates and advocates of racial equality, by and large, were very clear, and almost across the board. I'm even talking about comparatively conservative people like Whitney Young from the National Urban League, that an essential condition for continued improvement of the position of Black Americans in American society was continued expansion of the social state, right, of a new social wage policy at the federal level, and continued growth of the labor movement, and especially the CIO. And this only became a dichotomous or the suggestion that the relationship between racial justice and economic justice were dichotomous. Only became a sort of common sense after Black Power, right? Or as part of the Black Power transformation of public consciousness or a political discourse.
Can I ask you about that? That's a really important piece of history. This is interesting to me, and I actually am curious specifically about where the Black Panthers actually fit on that continuum of what they represented politically. But if I read you correctly, and I always, every time we have on Harvey K on the show, who's the great, New Deal historian, we always talk about A. Philip Randolph.
Yeah.
And emphasize that it was the march for jobs and justice. And so if I read you correctly, it's that in the popular culture, people look at something like the Nation of Islam and they'll take, okay, this has some, great flamboyant rhetoric. It sounds very powerful and revolutionary, and then programmatically it's start a small business and pray 5 times a day and fund the NOI. And then they go, oh, look at all these boring guys talking about integrating, counters in starched shirts. When in reality, that contingent is dismantling American apartheid and saying we need to have social democracy for everyone, regardless of identity. That's actually quite a radical position, and somehow it got switched in perception.
Right. Well, look, I mean, first of all, I should offer this with like a mea culpa, because I became a Black Power era radical, right? I mean, I was 19 when Carmichael made that speech on the Meredith March, or on the march after the Meredith March, and I mean, I was a 19-year-old college student, right? Part of the rising generation of what was going to be the post-Jim Crow Black PMC, right? And I and a lot of other people like me were quite taken with that, right? And I mean, swept up in it, and exactly for the reasons that you say. I mean, because we'd been adolescents who first of all had been wowed and inspired by Malcolm X as an orator and a take no prisoners kind of iconoclast, right? And juxtapose that with the images of and for a lot of us and in our own daily lives of seeing civil rights workers singing while they were being beaten and carried off to jail. Right. And that was great. My son has been saying for some time that if Malcolm were alive today, he'd be a stand-up comic and a damn good one. But so yeah, I mean, that seemed radical. You've got the backdrop. I mean, not just of Randolph, but Rustin having already been smeared in '64 as Lyndon Johnson's agent in Atlantic City and trying to induce the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to accept the compromise that the Johnson administration proposed, which would give them no vote in 1964, but came with a presence or with a promise that no Jim Crow that delegation would be seated from the state of Mississippi or like any place else after that. So that's the beginning of Rustin getting a bad name. And a lot of people, like in the anti-war movement, thought that he was a sellout because he didn't. It's not quite clear the extent to which Rustin actually supported the war in Vietnam, but he did argue in the Freedom Budget that there was a way for the federal government to support the objectives of the Freedom Budget and prosecute the war in Vietnam. And look, I mean, he thought he was playing a long game with the Johnson administration. And then there's kind of the sad story of the way that Rustin wound up as a guy out there. There's a ship out at sea with no port, and he winds up in the company of the right-wing Social Democrats and basically a shill for Israel, because one of the main things he did in the by the end of the 60s and beginning of the 70s was to recruit people to sign the basic statement, Black Americans Support Israel Committee.
There are some Jewish people of a certain generation who the only civil rights leader they could have a good word to say for is Baird Rustin. Precisely
yeah, there you
because
go.
of that reason.
Right. I mean, there you go.
He was
exactly
very good on Israel. Were the Panthers, though...
Right, on the Panthers. All right.
Just in the sense that they fused a correct response, it seems to me, in terms of the rawness of the the energy against racism with actually at least at times, a Marxist analysis. Is that a right read?
Well, yeah, kind of. I mean, here's the thing, right?
Okay.
I mean, like in retrospect, and yeah, I mean, everybody was excited about the Panthers up to a point anyway, but But the thing is that, Todd Gitlin's book, The Whole World is Watching, the media, mass media and the making and unmaking of the New Left, is really good and important and smart about this kind of stuff. And anybody who's interested in the period, I would urge to read that book. I don't know how Todd feels about it now, but I think it's still great. Because what had happened, one of the things that televisual, part of the power of Black Power was its televisual projection.
Great
right?
aesthetics.
And like then, by the time from 66 to 69, and especially through the crisis in within SDS and that stuff, the left broadly got involved in a dialectic with the corporate media, such that you make headlines by having a big demo. The next big demo of the same size or twice the same size doesn't may get a headline, but it won't get a headline unless it's at least twice the same size. And then you get to a point where you don't get the headlines unless you make provocative, flamboyant statements, and then you don't get the headlines unless you bust stuff up, right? And I mean, when you think of characters like Carmichael and Mark Rudd and Huey Newton, these are guys in their mid-20s who were being feted all over the so-called third world and second world, right? And it's kind of tough to be a star, right? And feel whatever the genuine obligations are that you might feel to speak on behalf of a movement, and the next thing you know, speakers and leaders become movements, and that's one of the legacies that we live with today. That anybody who can get their microphone and have five friends to stand behind them, to stand behind them to picket, as long as they're saying the right kind of stuff, can get a spot on MSNBC. So a different kind of career imperative develops. The Panthers got caught up in that right early on, and the gesturing and the posturing and the black leather jackets and the guns and the berets and so forth and so on gets them into legal trouble, and the legal trouble gets them into situations where they've got to raise a lot of money, and I can hear or I can feel the listeners who will spit their coffee out at the moment that I invoke the name Tom Wolfe. But Tom Wolfe's account in Radical Chic and Mau-Mauing the flag catchers of that Panthers fundraiser at Leonard Bernstein's house is brilliant, because that was another dynamic. So it's like shocking, the white liberals. I can tell you this. Right. This is a personal experience. When I visited the Fort Dix coffee house, anti-war GI coffee house project in the fall of 1969, and it was run as a collective, and there was all. You could already see the kind of inward-looking tendencies, that developed in the New Left. I think this project was run by a bunch of people who had left Columbia after the strike, and they had all that kind of stuff, the ritual purification, and all that. And the guy who was the principal male, say, the Mick Jagger of the organizing collective, was that kind of preener and posturer and macho, and he asked me to come down to the office with him, and they were serious people. They'd been firebombed a few weeks before, but to come down to the office with him to meet with this Panther from Jersey City, and it was fascinating to see how the Panther played it and to see the effect that it had on this guy. I won't mention his name. I don't know if he's still alive or what he's doing now, but he turned from totally expressive macho man chopping wood, firing off AK-47s, to simpering, meek, submissive, almost unable, to get a complete sentence out in the face of this Panther, who was sitting there behind his dark glasses and hardly saying anything and just being smug and so forth and so on. And the guy actually tried to get me, I was living and working in North Carolina again. The guy actually tried to get me to help him locate a renegade that they were looking for in North Carolina. And I thought, I don't know what kind of cop you are, but there's a 50% chance you're some kind of cop, because that's the other thing about it. Like outside the West Coast and maybe Chicago, but especially up on the East Coast to the Northeast, by the end of the 60s, I think there were probably more cops in BPP chapters than there were anybody else. Man, I had a couple of other incidents with them in North Carolina when I was working. So here I think is a way to look at the Panthers, right? That they started out as a kind of black power group, right? With a specific focus on police brutality. And then through the game of can you top this or whatever, they wound up getting into this spot where they were encouraged themselves. I'm not saying the police made them do this at all, but got into this show business of the revolutionary posture, right? I mean, I remember James Boggs in his collection of essays, The Racism and the Class Struggle, 1970 now, but he says about the Panthers, can you imagine a guerrilla fighter walking down a main street in Saigon wearing a jacket that says guerrilla fighter on the back of it, right? And by the time I went down, by the beginning of the 70s, I'd read the Panther paper and see that it was mainly about trying to demonstrate that living in black inner cities was like living under an occupying army. And that was true, right? I mean, the first time I saw the film, I've said this a lot of places, but the first time I saw the film The Battle of Algiers, I thought, wow, I know this movie, I was in this movie when I was in high school in New Orleans, right? I mean, but on reading the newspaper, you would ask, okay, well, if you're living under occupation, then you don't need to be told you're living under occupation. Because one thing about living under occupation is that you know you're being occupied. So who is the Black Panther Party directed to, right? And what? Right?
Oh, I see.
No. I'm only shut up for a second and listen.
No, I don't want you to shut up. I want you. In fact, we only have a couple more minutes, so I need to reiterate. I hope we can do regular segments together. But
sure, I'd love to, man.
That is so. But then let's actually, maybe what we could do is we can use this as a through line to loop to where we are today, because the trajectory that I see, and I want to kind of sometimes when you use, at least for me, I think international examples help kind of ease a point or contextualize something as a trend. So when South Africa was liberated by the ANC in this extraordinary political accomplishment, aided by their strategic acumen and with support from Sweden and the Soviet Union and so on, then they emerge in a world where there's one way. The Soviet Union has collapsed, the neoliberal model is ascendant. And then I'm very sympathetic. I don't really see, at least in my reading of things, what room they had in the first phase in terms of embracing pretty austere policies. It doesn't seem to me that they had much room for maneuver. And when
I agree.
And so when Thabo Mbeki gets into power, and he is really pushing through gear, these I think it was growth, development, basically the IMF programs.
Right.
That's when he embraces this notion of the African Renaissance. And And I just want to be another thing that I think is also very ridiculously representative people, you, but also anybody with a socialist point of view in general, is like, look, if the choice of politics is between white nationalist capitalism and multiracial capitalism, we will pick multiracial, multi-identity capitalism because that is less harmful than exclusively white male capitalism. Our desire is to have a world where we don't have, 1% of the population, however it is configured, sucking up all of the resources. But that what happens, so if we looked at it globally, we could say that, there's this broader collapse of social democratic parties. There's, these mandates on developing countries. And so what becomes as both a matter of necessity is, well, maybe the best we can do is try to at least diversify the elite. And I think that loops with the other part of your work, which is that the other really essential function, and this ties in with the Panthers, is that on the liberal side of that, then there needs to be brokers. There needs to be people who explain to you how these magical communities that you could never possibly understand work, even though, of course, it's like, I don't know, communities are communities. There's different classes. There's different, somebody from Guyana and Brooklyn has a different outlook probably than somebody who's a fifth generation American in South Carolina. You kind of navigate and think about these things. And so that today, even something, and I Sanders, I cannot support any more than I support. And so I hate people who use, I think there's such a performativity to talking about how limited his program is. The reality is, in context of modern politics, it is revolutionary. But that being said, a social democrat, just a solid social democratic push that Sanders represents is a threat to that through line, and therefore entire subsections of the broader professional class.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay.
No, that is I mean, that's the most precise, pristine summary of the contradiction I've heard, and I'm not just saying that because I'm on your show. No, I mean that's exactly what the problem is, and I mean, like you remember, and like before we run out of time, I want to say one more thing about Rustin. So
please,
but I'll get to that in a second if I can. But I mean, you remember that Joy-Ann Reid and the MSNBC crowd, right? Around the beginning of this year, were went into overtime, right, doubling and tripling down on the anti-Sanders rhetoric and about how he can't appeal to black people, when the poll data were showing that black Americans supported him at a higher level even than young people or on the liberal Democrats. And in my own experience, I know it's anecdotal, but I've seen it like often enough, like in a lot of places, Philadelphia, most recently this past the weekend in South Carolina, but a lot of other places. I mean, down here, when you sort of sport Sanders paraphernalia, I can't tell you how common it is for working class black people just to come up and say, Bernie, that's my guy, I love him, right? Mm-hmm. And it makes sense because people who work for a living understand what that program is, and that is the threat. That's the threat to the entire brokerage section of the PMC, and as the identitarian compromise, like with neoliberalism, well, it's not even a compromise, right? I mean, there's the identitarian symbiosis with neoliberalism, because identity politics has always been a class politics anyway. But as it gets tighter and tighter and has expanded to more and more old or newly recognized groups, then that's like a bigger chunk of the politicized PMC. So I mean, that's where the struggle is, and I guess that's another reason that the PMC issue is back on the table, or ought to be. But the thing I wanted to say about Rustin, though, and like this kind of patches back to Black Power, and again, like whatever I say about Rustin in the '60s, I say with a mea culpa, because I was one of those people who was opposed to him too. Rustin did an essay on Black Power in Commentary in 1966. following on the famous or the infamous, depending on your point of view, from protest to politics that he did in 1965. He argued in the 1965 essay that that now that the victories in the South had been won, we basically cleared out that backwater, and for the future we needed a different kind of movement. And he said it. I don't even know if it makes sense to call it a civil rights movement anymore, but what we need is a broader working class based alliance of trade unions, liberals, and others to advance what he was pretty clear was a social democratic agenda. In '66, he said in his essay on Black Power that the thing that was most likely going to come out of it was a new brokerage class, right? Like a new black political elite. And on reading that, so many decades later, I thought, wow, well, he called Adolph right, because by the time, within a decade, right, less than a decade of that piece, it was pretty clear that that's that's who won Black Power. It only became clearer later, I guess, that the extent to which the Black Power insurgency was the political expression of this emerging petty bourgeoisie, or this new political class of urban managers or others, frankly, both in the private sector as well as the public sector, whose their material interests were tied up in one way or another, directly or indirectly, in the emerging race relations management industry, and that's kind of where we are today.
And that's where we are today. I actually, you know what, I'm gonna just push it, because I do just want to ask you one more thing that I think is really important to touch on. So I want to keep reemphasizing that. In fact, Professor Reed's work is not only anti-racist, it's much more omnivorous in its awareness of racist tendencies running through every line of politics, and not just the obvious ones, a la Trumpism. So what I want to note here, so there's this, and again, going back to the strong clarity about the blaming the poor rhetoric and the racialized attacks on the poor in the 90s, which were embraced across the political spectrum and, had material consequences and something as vicious as welfare reform.
Right. Yep.
When you look at the current rhetoric on the Trump voter, and look, I'm perfectly willing to stipulate, at least myself, and maybe you have a different view on it, I don't know, but there's a big part of the Republican base and there's nothing magical about Trump. They've been voting on some form of kind of white identity politics for quite some time. And that's a problem, and it's ongoing. And at different points, Democrats have appealed to the same type of white identity politics for sure. However, as a narrative structure right now, the liberal discourse on the deplorables, it's not the same. It's, there's different stakes for sure. But just as a matter of literary structure, like if we were just to say, like, this is how you write a screenplay. And one screenplay is, whatever, I don't know, Field of Dreams, another is Beverly Hills Cop. But this is how you write it, right? It's the same. Like, there's this new book called Dying of Whiteness. And look, he comes up with some incredible examples of huge racism and disgusting sentiments of Trump voters. And it's real. And it's I mean, what else is new? I had a big allergy, because I was like, at a certain point, skimming this and reading the reviews, I won't lie that I read the book, but I've heard the interviews, I've read enough. It's like, no, people aren't fucking dying of whiteness. They're dying because of opioid addiction and obesity. And so we're going into this magical land of metaphor, which sounds like we are back. It's different, but it parallels. Well, what's really going on is they're listening to Two Live Crew. That's why they can't get a job.
Yep.
And it's the same narrative structure.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is, man. And it's maddening. I mean, I was just talking to two white workers. One, they're both in a steelworkers local, like in Georgetown, South Carolina. One is in the steel mill, the other's in the paper mill. And it's pretty clear they were both Trump voters. The one guy pointed out that he voted for Obama, right? And I mean, there was some percentage of people out there who just wanted somebody to break through the bullshit and to shake things up, right? And that's a dangerous way to think about politics, right? Because that's what, that's what gives you the fascist demagogue, right? But if the Democrats don't offer anything to working people except condescension and scorn, right? People aren't stupid. They can feel the condescension. They can hear, feel, and taste the scorn. And like the guy who had voted for Obama first said that he could get with Bernie's economic program, right? He likes that, or almost all of it. But the thing you can't understand is why the Democrats don't come correct, in his view, on what he called the moral questions. And I mean, so what I said to him was, well, look, I mean, think about it like the union and the workplace, right? Like, I know there are people in your unit that you like, people you don't like, people you can't stand, people you can't wait for the whistles to blow so you can get away from. But when it comes to shared interest in the bargaining unit or in the union, like, you find ways to set aside those other disagreements, right, to focus on the things that you share, right? And I tried out on him like a line I've been waiting to try it on somebody anyway, which is more important to you, right? That you have health care and a decent job, or that somebody else can have an abortion if they want it, or which is more important to you, that you have the rights on a job and a decent place to live, or that a same-sex couple can get married someplace else, right? And like, this is the thing, and he hemmed and hawed because this was only like a chance encounter. I feel pretty good that if I were in a position, or somebody else who's in a position to establish some confidence or some standing, with this guy, could probably move him over time. But I mean, here's the thing, right? The Democrats haven't offered working people anything since at least Bill Clinton, and except the condescension and scorn and a promise of some 3 weeks of key punch training under the job or the Trade Adjustment Act.
Key punch training, right.
And I mean, for me, like, the most important number from the 2016 election is that somewhere between 6.5 and 9 million people who voted for Trump had voted for Sanders in the primaries and Obama at least once. And as far as I'm concerned, like, from my perspective, winning that. A lot of those people, there's as much racism like in a society as you can find. But I mean, racism is like an attitude anyway. People need to remember that, right? Like, it's not. But no matter. So, but I mean, some would vote for Trump just because of racism. Some for some, in the absence of any other coherent narrative that offered them the possibility of making their lives better, then the racist narrative was familiar enough or attractive enough, to work. But we've got to believe that that a big chunk of those, and I don't know how many, I mean, who does, but a big chunk of those, maybe up to 9 million voters, would have voted for something else, no matter how they feel about black people as an abstraction or even in the concrete. And those are the people that we need to win, right? Those aren't the only people we need to win, but we've got to win those people back, and that's the key to building the movement that we need to improve the lives of working people of whatever color, gender, sexual orientation
And doesn't that also just, not to cut you off as we wrap up, I just want to say, but doesn't that even also just answer this whole question in the sense that if somebody says, in order to secure my vote, you need to support legal and housing discrimination against trans people, and I want to work towards formal legal separation of the races. Okay, that's never going to happen. That's a 5-second conversation. Right. And if somebody else says, maybe in the privacy of my own head or home, I have some repulsive personal beliefs, but I'm willing to, vote for this broad multiracial coalition because I want health care. Well, cool. We'll take your vote. Thanks.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And this is another problem about the left I've been railing about a lot for a while now, that this notion that politics is about displaying who deserves to go to heaven and who deserves to go to hell, or it's like pledging a frat, right? You got to show that you accept all the core beliefs to be part of our movement is absolutely self-defeating, and it just feels, I don't know, well, I guess I do feel kind of comfortable, as I said to Nathan Robinson, saying this in this city, but it just feels like a way too Protestant approach, to politics for me.
It's way too Protestant. Obviously, I think with a Jewish and Catholic background, we could align on that.
Absolutely, totally. Well, yeah. Well, I tell you, I've got a good friend who has long said you have two choices with your kids. You can either raise them Catholic or Jewish, or they might turn out religious.
Professor Adolph Reed, thank you so much for doing this. Please come back again soon.
Oh man, I'd love to do it as soon as you want. So thanks again.
Guys, please read Adolph Reed. All right, we're running late. We're going to go to the post game. Nando and I are going to get into our. We're going to get undressed. Thanks, everybody. So get Patreoned up, patreon.com/TMBS, and get all the content. We'll see you in the post game, everybody.